in a paper about the effects of democracy on civil culture. This is a joint paper with a number of authors. So Nicolas, you have 1 hour, including questions. If someone else has questions during the presentation, just ask directly. Okay, so go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Raimundo. Thank you, everyone, for the invitation. I'm going to present this paper that is actually part of a bigger project on democracy, on the effects of democracy on what we call culture. This is a joint paper with, well, with quite a few co-authors that you see there, and this is actually I think the second time I present this paper, third time. So this is actually a good moment to receive feedback. So please interrupt me whenever you think it's a good time. So let me start with a bit of motivation. You know, there's a widespread consensus, I would say, in economics, but probably most of social sciences, that civic culture matters, right? So you know, cooperation, trust, honesty, all of these have been proven to matter in terms of economic development, and more specifically, there seem to be important drivers of economic growth. So the question is, what is the origin of this civic culture, or what we actually, you know, call this paper, you know, what we actually care about in this paper, which is what we call the cooperative culture. So the question is, what makes us humans to cooperate, and more importantly, what makes us human cooperate with strangers or with people that we don't know? And when we take a look to the literature, or actually to the many literatures that have been trying to explore this, because this is certainly a question that goes beyond economics, so you can find explanations, you know, or hypotheses coming from, you know, anthropology, sociology, biology, psychology, and so on. But when you look to the literature in economics, basically, you know, since the last probably 20 or 15 years, there's this emerging literature that at this point I think it's quite established, that basically tries to explain the coevolution of two things that we focus on this paper, which are basically institutions, or some type of institutions on one hand, and what we call a cooperative culture in the other hand. So if there's a coevolution between institutions and culture, then there must be, there could be something to explore in that dimension, and that's exactly what we try to do. So in this paper, as you can imagine from the title, we basically try to focus on one particular type of institution, which is democracy. And we try to show that growing up in a democracy will trigger or will promote what we call a cooperative culture. Now, before going on, I'm going to mention the word civic culture probably 150 times in the next 60 minutes. So I think it's a good time now to try to define a little bit what am I talking about when I say civic culture. And to be kind of schematic, I'll be basically adopting a notion that is going to be akin to two kind of big or broad definitions of civic culture that are kind of classic in both political science, in this case, and economics, in this case, which are the following. So first, following Almond and Verva, they define civic culture as a set of beliefs, attitudes, norms, perception, and the like that support participation, are probably more closely to the outcomes that we have. Luigi Wiso and co-authors basically define what they call civic capital as those persistent and shared beliefs and values that help a group overcome the free rider problem in the pursuit of socially valuable activities. So as you see, basically what we try to explain here is the motivation to cooperate. Okay.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So your definition is based on beliefs. So there is a one-to-one relationship with certain actions? Can we recover beliefs from actions, or how do we identify beliefs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. So if you wait 2 minutes, when I present the outcomes, I'm going to be talking about three things. I'm going to be talking about actions, basically behavior, and then I'm going to be talking about two things that could support those actions. That I think that's what you have in mind. One is beliefs, so basically a strategic behavior, thinking on what the rest are going to do, and one, and a couple of a bunch of other outcomes that are related to preferences or values, which is basically what is kind of intrinsic in terms of what gives me utility. So I'm going to talk about the three things, right? But wait me just 2 minutes, and I'm going to be a bit more specific about that.
Okay, we talk later. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So this just to say that we are by no means the first trying to explore this relationship, right? So again, this is just illustrative and for motivation. So this is just a correlation, but I think it's good to understand where are we. I mean, what type of kind of correlation we have in mind when we try to explore this causal effect. So what you see here is democracy. So this is an index of democracy that, again, in 2 minutes I'm going to define what index are we using, but just for now, just think that this is an index of the quality of democracy. So 0 is that there's no democracy at all, and 1 means that you have a very strong democracy. And what you see here is what we call the Tavellini index, which again, in 1 minute, I'm going to define very precisely, but this is basically an index of cooperation. So think of this as, giving money to charity, donating, organs and so on. So basically this is an index of impersonal cooperation. And this positive correlation that you see here is actually quite robust to basically everything that you put here and everything you put here. So instead of the Tavellini index, you put trust, you'll find exactly the same thing. If instead of that, you put something like the number of NGOs per capita, you'll find the same thing. So this correlation between a cooperative culture and democratic institutions is something that is quite robust and quite well established in the literature, almost a kind of stylized fact. Right? Now, obviously, the question when you observe this and when we observe this for the first time is what is the direction of this causality, right? So there are many reasons to believe that it could go either way, from culture to institutions or from institutions to culture. And actually, there are many good reasons that have been written in kind of old tradition of strands of the literature trying to argue in both dimensions, right? So you have a bunch of papers following, following the tradition of going all the way back to the tradition of the Tocqueville. The Tocqueville has this very classic book. It's called Democracy in America, in which he basically tries to understand the U.S. and democracy in the U.S. and he basically says that there's something about American culture that is what he called the civic virtues of individual, and what we call what he defines as enlightened self-interest, right? And he basically makes this definition because he says, look, if you take a look to Americans, they're going to be self-interested in the sense that they're going to look for the best for them, but they're going to be enlightened in the sense that they acknowledge that the best for them is to actually cooperate with the rest, right? So this is what he says. This is the type of enlightened and self-interest culture that actually sustains a strong democracy, right? So according to this tradition, basically it goes from culture to institutions. And if you take a look to maybe the last 20 or 25 years, there are many authors that try to pick up this definition both in political science and economics, and basically trying to find that you actually need a cooperative culture to sustain cooperation. So that's kind of one strand of the literature. On the other hand, you can go all the way back to John Stuart Mill and find exactly the opposite type of arguments, right? So what he has in mind is that you actually, when you have formal democracy, when you have a strong democratic institutions, then the exercise of democracy and the exercise of deciding together and trying to find consensus and deliberating and being tolerant and being acceptant of the defeats and so on. Well, the exercise of that type of democracy is what actually shapes this cooperative culture that we observe. Right? So in a way, what we try to do is we try to show some evidence consistent with the John Stuart Mill tradition, which is not to say that the Tocqueville is wrong, but it's just to show that it could be something going from institutions to culture and not necessarily the other way around. Okay, so that's kind of the main idea of the paper. And now let me give you some more specific previews. And this is exactly the point that you made before about beliefs and preferences. And we're going to try to explore both of them. Okay, so basically we're going to show 2 or 3 important results and then some heterogeneities, but these are the main points that we want to make. So first of all, we're going to show that people that grow up in a democracy, and again, I'm going to be more specific about what that means, but basically people that are exposed to a democracy during a certain time of their lives, they're going to display higher levels of what we call civic engagement. These are actions, these are behaviors, okay? So we are going to have basically a measure that we take off-shelf of an index that is called the Civic Engagement Index. That is a measure of impersonal cooperation. It's going to basically reflect things like, as I said before, donating money, volunteering time, and so on. So basically cooperation outside your kin, outside your community. So in this paper, we try to explain cooperation with strangers, not cooperation within the community. So all the measures that we have out of this type. And again, as you said before, or when you think about action or actions of cooperation, then that could be potentially supported by, again, being a bit schematic, two type of things, right? So you can think that you are doing that, I mean, you're being cooperative because, because you have cooperative preferences, right? So you have norms of reciprocity, or you are altruistic, or whatever, and that's what actually is triggering your cooperative behavior. Or it could actually be related to beliefs, right? So let's say that you trust that the rest are going to behave in a certain way, and for you the best strategy is going to actually follow the rules, and therefore it's not explained by your intrinsic motivations or your intrinsic preferences to behave in a cooperative way, but by something more related to strategic behavior. So we're going to explore all of these, right, or different dimensions of all of this. So regarding preferences, we're going to show that actually people growing up in a democracy display also more what we call impersonally prosocial preferences. Okay, so we're going to have different measures of civic values, self-reported civic values that are going to be consistent with more prosocial preferences, and that's going to be one set of results. And then we are going to directly explore outcomes that are, I mean, they're coming from a survey, but they're experimentally validated outcomes related to social preferences. And what they're going to show is that people exposed to democracy are going to be more reciprocal. Again, so think that these are experimentally validated results. So it's like in the lab, you find that people are more reciprocal. And we are going to find no effect on altruism. Okay, so this means that in our case, at least in this setting, what is going to motivate a behavior reflected in personal cooperation is not going to be altruism. It's not going to be that people actually, like to help the others because that's going to provide them more utility. It's actually that they have the norms of reciprocity. Okay, so again, going to your first question, we're going to document first some results related to preferences. Then we're going to document some results referred to beliefs. And when we talk about beliefs, we typically have in mind trust, right? So trust is basically belief, what you think that the rest of the world are going to do. And this is interesting because we're going to have outcomes related to what we call outgroup trust, which is basically trust in people that you don't know. So that's kind of impersonal trust. And then what we call in-group trust, which is basically trust in your kin, trust in your family, trust in people that you know. And what we're going to find is that, as expected, there's an effect on outgroup trust, so basically an effect on trust in strangers, but there's no effect on in-group trust. Okay, so basically, this is going to be consistent with what we are trying to explain, which is impersonal cooperation and cooperation outside your community. Okay, so this is going to be kind of the main set of results that I'm going to show you, and then I'm going to show you some additional results to try to understand what is going on in a bit more specific way. Let me very briefly tell you what I think our results fit the literature. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here because I don't think that makes sense, but at least I would like to show you what has been written about this. And I think, again, kind of schematically, there are basically two strands of the literature that are somehow related to our paper. So one is what I mentioned before as the top-built tradition that obviously has some, that is obviously reflected in some more modern literature in economics and political science. Again, what these papers show, I think this is, if I'm not wrong, this and AJ or something like that, they basically show that culture triggers institutions. So basically, there's a causal effect going from a civic culture to democratic institutions. Well, we complement this basically by showing the exact opposite effect. So there's, if this is true, then what we are showing is kind of a reinforcing effect or a democratic multiplier, right? Because they're showing that civic culture affects institutions. We are showing that institutions actually affect civic culture. So we complement that literature. And then there's another literature which we kind of summarize in these three bullets, but it's a bit more extensive. That is a bit more theoretical and a bit more experimental than what we do. Okay, so again, there are a few more theoretical papers trying to show how culture can affect institutions, and more importantly, there are a few experimental papers in the lab basically showing exactly the same thing that we show. So this is probably the most famous paper, Balbo et al. I think it's 2010. That basically they show the same that we show, but in a completely controlled setting. So what they show is that if in a lab experiment you let people decide about the rules of the game, which is basically, you know, a measure of democracy, then you're going to find that people is more cooperative. So it's exactly what we try to show. But we contribute to this basically by showing the same result in a more real world setting using, again, real world democracy and real world outcomes. So this is basically the main setting of the paper. Now let me very briefly tell you what I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you some data, some description of the data and some description of empirical strategy. I'm going to show you some main effects, and then if I have some time, I'm going to show you some nuances about this process. Basically, I'm going to try to show you how different dimensions of democracy, again, liberal democracy, electoral democracy, deliberative democracy, and so on, they could actually have different effects on the formation of this cooperative culture. I'm not sure if I'm going to have time for this, but for sure I'm going to have time to show you at least the main results. All right, so let me very briefly describe the data that I'm going to use. I'm going to use different data sets, actually I think 4 data sets that I'm going to combine for basically 100 years or so, starting in 1911 for basically the whole world. The first important variable is the variable measuring democratic institutions, basically measuring the quality of democracy. And in this case, I'm going to use a data set that is called the VDEM project. Okay, so the VDEM project, it's a relatively new project. It has probably 10 years or so. In these last 10 years, it has been already, papers using this data set in political science have been already published in top journals, American Political Science Review, American Journal of Political Science, because it brings some advantages versus the typical data sets that we tend to use, that actually other data sets that I have been used in the past, like Polity or Freedom House and so on. And this is for a couple of reasons. So this is basically a measure of democracy, of the quality of democracy, that is trying to measure democracy not as a binary variable, not as a 0, 1, but actually as a continuous measure of the quality of democracy. So this is going to be important because I'm going to show you that in this case, what it matters is more the intensive margin of democracy, meaning you can find a difference when you increase the quality of democracy than just the extensive margin, which is just 0, 1. Yeah, this is going to be important because they actually have a measure of, a continuous measure of a quality of democracy that is actually giving me a lot, much more variability that I'm going to be using. This data set basically brings or measures 5 dimensions of democracy that are based on political theory: electoral, participative, deliberative, liberal, and egalitarian democracy. So basically, this is in the last part of the paper, we try to understand which of these is more important for the formation of a cooperative culture. In the first result, I'm going to show just the aggregated index, but it's important to know that we can actually try to understand, which of these is more important, and we are going to try to do that. And finally, this is a bit more, if you want, more kind of practical, more empirical. But when you take a look to this data set, as opposed to other data sets, they seem to reflect, something that, at least intuitively seems to be much more related to kind of the common sense that people will have in mind. So this is, for example, a comparison between the VDEM, that is basically this index, at the typical measures of democracy that economists and political science typically use, that are Polity and Freedom House, and these some selected countries. So this, for example, the US. So if you take, for example, democracy in the US using Polity and Freedom House, this is exactly what you will find, right? So basically a 1 that goes from 1900 to the present, basically completely constant in every moment of time. And this is what our index do, which is basically try to understand, the different levels of democracy that could happen. That is certainly not the 0, 1, but actually a continuous. And I think it's very difficult to believe that democracy in the US was the same in 1920 than in 2000. And actually our index is trying to reflect that. And I think that's why it makes much more sense to use this type of index. So that's for institutions. Then I'm going to use several different data sets for culture that I'm going to define or describe very, very briefly. So first of all, as I said before,
question.
Yeah,
just for an outsider. So these indexes are just for like government, like political institutions, or is broader, like involve unions and other non-partisans stuff?
Yeah, so that's that's actually a very important point, because so basically most of these indexes are related to political institutions. There are some of them that actually include some things related to what you said, and what we do is we try to clean that, because that could be actually endogenous, right? In the sense that this is basically our outcome. I mean, we try to see associative patterns, outside politics, and that could be a problem. So what we do is, it's not a big deal, because most of them are basically political institutions, but for those that they're not, we try to clean that out. Okay.
Okay. So whenever you say democratic institutions, you're mainly talking about political activities. It has nothing to do with restrictions for unions or restrictions of, say, suppose race. Racism in the U.S. might be good or bad, or getting worse or bad time, but it's not involved in this index. Just look at if these guys vote or how the Congress works, etc. Am I right?
Okay, so more or less. So what you described is basically the index of electoral democracy. Right? So electoral democracy measures exactly what you said, which is if you vote, if you don't, if elections are free, and so on. Then the second thing that you mentioned is basically what the literature call liberal democracy. Okay, so basically respecting minorities and so on, that's liberal democracy. And then you have other dimensions of democracy that also matter, that are, for example, if you have a more direct or more indirect democracy and so on, that are measured in the other indexes. Okay, so to that question, this is going to be in the main specification is going to be a mix between everything that you said. Okay, so basically liberal, deliberative, electoral, and so on. Then in a more detailed analysis, we try to differentiate between the different types of the different dimensions of democracy. For example, what you said about respecting minorities and so on, and just the electoral process itself. Okay? And just to, again, I'm not sure if I'm going to have time to show that, but just to preview, we're going to show you that electoral democracy itself is not enough. It's not enough to promote a cooperative culture. Okay. All right, so again, very quickly about the other type of data that we are using. We are measuring cooperation or cooperative culture using different data sets. The first one is a measure that, again, we take off-shelf as it comes from the Gallup World Polls. The Gallup World Polls is basically a survey that is performed every year in all the world. For many years, we didn't have access to all the weights, okay? So we have only a couple of weights. But basically they have one variable that is what they call the Gallup Index of Civic Engagement. That is basically a mix between people that volunteer time, people that donate blood, and people that report to help others. Okay, so this is basically an index of civic engagement that tries to measure what we try to measure, which is personal cooperative behavior. And this is going to be an index of behavior. Now, as I said before, this could be supported by different type of things like preferences and beliefs. So I'm going to explain exactly what type of measures we are using for both. For preferences, we have two types of data sets. One is the World Value Survey that basically tries to measure, again, it's a survey that is conducted in basically every country in the world every 4 or 5 years. There are 7 weights of this. It's an index that is widely used. And basically we take a definition of an index of values that was and then that was used by Luigi Guiso in 2011. That is basically the following. Basically, there's a question that asks about the values that you want to transmit to your children, okay? And basically asks the following. So here is a list of qualities that children can be encouraged to learn at home, which, if any, do you consider to be especially important? And then basically this index is going to sum positive responses to tolerance, free choice, and the opposite of obedience, which is basically the lack of obedience. Now, when I present this, many people find this kind of unintuitive because these measures, if you think thoroughly about them, basically they try to reflect individualism, right? And many people tend to think that individualism is the opposite to cooperative behavior, and it's actually not. So individualism is, what the literature defines as individualism is actually the opposite to what we call collectivism. right? So when you think about very collectivist societies, very hierarchical democracies, then what you would observe is that actually people cooperate within group, within the community, within their kin, but basically they cooperate because they don't want to deviate, because they know that if they deviate, if they are not loyal to the leader, if they are not loyal to the group, then, you know, they're going to be punished, right? So basically they cooperate because otherwise, no, they're going to be enforced to cooperate. And what we try to capture here is exactly the opposite, right? So we try to capture preferences for cooperating with the strangers actually outside the group. Okay, so basically what we try to capture here is a measurement of individualism that is the opposite of collectivism. Okay, now this is one type of preference. Now the other type of preference are what you would typically call social preferences. Okay. Now, for social preferences, we use a data set that is called the Global Preference Survey. Global Preference Survey was a survey that was conducted in 2012 in 80 countries. And the cool thing about this data set is that they elicit social preferences using, you know, certain questions that are experimentally validated. Okay, so basically they measure, you know, a bunch of different preferences. We focus on those two that are more important for this case, that are reciprocity, positive and negative reciprocity, and altruism, and we use these two as the main, I mean, as two potential preferences that could be supporting a cooperative behavior, right? And actually, reciprocity and altruism are those type of preferences that typically that are thought to be supporting cooperative cooperation in the literature of experimental economics. So basically, try to explore these two avenues. Now, one additional thing that I didn't mention about preference is that we are also going to use a variable that is kind of more mechanic, if you will, which is an index of preferences for democracy, which is basically going to ask people if they like democracy as the best and most preferred type of government. Okay. And finally, again, from the World Value Survey, we are going to use variables related to trust to measure beliefs. So this one is the most common way of measuring trust, which is if you think that most people can be trusted. Again, it's a trusting belief, generalized and impersonal. So this is going to be one of our variables. Now we're going to go one step ahead and we're going to explore, as I said before, beliefs trusting beliefs about in-group and about out-group. So basically we have trust in strangers that reflect out-group trust, and trust in family that refers to in-group trust. Okay, so we're going to be exploring these two. Now, very briefly, let me show you a couple of just some selected countries, trying to show how the democracy index looks like, just for you to understand what is the type of variability that we are going to try to exploit, which is the following. So basically we show this to show that there's a lot of, across country variation, but there's also a lot of, variation within country cross cohort, right? So if you take a look to Argentina, for example, I'm Argentinian. I was born in the 80s. So basically, when I was born, and more importantly, when I grew up, there was all democracy, full democracy. I mean, all my life, I've been living in a full, complete democracy. But if you weren't exactly in the same country, but I don't know, 20 years before or 25 years before, then you would actually be growing up in the worst or most cruel autocracy and dictatorship had in history. So basically, someone that was born in the 80s has a completely different experience than someone that was born in the 60s. And this is the same for a lot of countries in the world. And actually you can see that, and this is a graph that my co-authors hate and everyone hates, but I really like it because it basically shows what I try to transmit, that when you take a look to the variability of all the countries in the world in terms of exposure to democracy, it's actually a mess. And it's a mess because you have a lot of countries that always experience democracy, some countries that always experience autocracy, and then a lot of countries that experience a lot of democracy and autocracy depending on the exact year in which you were born. Okay, and I like this because basically this type of variability, this cross-cohort variability, is the one that I'm going to be exploiting to identify a causal effect, or what we claim is a causal effect. Okay. All right, so now let me describe the empirical strategy that we're going to use, which is based on other papers in the literature of economics, which is what is called the impressionable years thesis. Now, for those of you that never heard about this has an old tradition in the literature of psychology, but was introduced into the literature in economics only, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago by Paola Giuliana Spilimbergo, and I think this is QJE or Restart, I don't remember. Basically, what they show is that if you grow up, meaning if in your early adulthood you are exposed to in their case to a recession, then you are going to have a long-lasting effect on your preference for redistribution that are going to be long-lasting for your entire life. So basically, what they have in mind is that there's a certain period of life in which the type of events that you're exposed to are particularly impressive and therefore long-lasting. And this is actually based on, as I said before, on a last tradition in psychology that basically defines these years of early adulthood as the impressionable years that goes approximately between 18 and 25 years old. So according to this literature, if you were exposed to certain events in particular during this time, then something is going to have to certain attitudes and beliefs that are going to last forever, and that's going to be very difficult if you're exposed before that age or after that age to exactly the same shock. So as you can be imagining, what I have in mind is that if you are exposed to democracy during this time of your life, then the effect that you're going to have in the cooperative behavior is going to be very different than if you were exposed exactly to the same shock, but instead of having 18 or 20 or 21, you have 30 years old. Okay? So that's basically the main idea of the identification strategy. Now, why do we think that this strategy could make sense in this context? I mean, what is special about the early adulthood they use between 18 and 25? And I think there are basically two ways of thinking about this that are basically the two ways that the literature in psychology presents the problem. One is that for some reason between 18 and 25 approximately your brain is more right. So basically you are anything that happens to you in that particular moment of life is going to have a larger effect than in any other moment of life, just because of kind of biological reasons, or chemical reasons. So that could be one way of seeing this. But I think there's another way of trying to think about this problem that makes much more sense in this particular context, which is the following. If you think about your early adulthood period, it's actually the first time in your life in which you have to start for the first time a lot of new interactions with strangers that are actually outside your family and outside your kin and outside your close community, right? So starting at 18 years old approximately, the scope of interactions that you could have, meaning the type of new interactions that you could potentially have is much more extended. And let me give you an example about this that I think it's quite it's quite descriptive. So actually think about the US, for example. So think that you were born in a town in Massachusetts, and until 18 years old you went to the same school and you met exactly the same people during 12, 13 years, and every Sunday or Saturday you went to the same church or synagogue or club or whatever, exactly the same thing during many years. And then you turn 18 and then you apply to college and you end up going to college in the middle of nowhere in the other side of the country. Right? So for the first time, you have the opportunity to have a lot of new interactions with strangers, and in a way you start to learn how to interact with people outside your kin and outside your community for the first time. Right? And again, this is an example, but if you think about entering the labor market, it's exactly the same thing, right? So the first time that you have actually an opportunity, for example, to join a union is when you turn 18 and you enter the labor market. And the same with joining a political party or an association or whatever that is going to actually force you to have new interactions with strangers and in a way, potentially, yeah.
Nicolas, that is true for the US and perhaps for modern European countries and perhaps the more developed countries. But in most of the rest of the world, that was not true. I mean, people started working earlier at 14 or 15. They didn't go to the university. So is this, how do you cope with that sort of difference? Because we're talking about, you're making a long-term thing for 100 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a good point. So one thing that we're going to explore now is exactly what you said. So for example, there are different times in which people enter the labor market, kind of, which is specific of the country, and that's kind of constant across time. So we're trying to explore these type of things to see if there's a difference. So what you said is true. And I wouldn't say that this age is kind of set in stone. It's not that it has to be exactly 18 to 35. what I'm going to show you is that approximately there's a kind of a spike approximately around the range, then goes down, right? So I mean, in a kind of taking advantage of what you said, we're exactly trying to do what you suggest, which is exploiting country-specific characteristics that would, kind of reduce the exposition of people to new interactions in this age, but we still don't have those results. So we are exploring that. But I mean, I would say that generally around these ages, this is in a way universal. So some cases you would enter at 15, and some cases you would enter at 21. But in a way, people start to leave their families at this age, and they start to have new families approximately between the 20s and the 30s. So in a way, there's kind of a period in the middle in which you are by yourself and you start to have new interactions and more repeated interactions, outside your family. That is probably more likely to happen approximately in this age. So let me put an example of Argentina. I mean, most of the people in Argentina study in the public university, and it's the first time that you have a lot of interactions with people completely different from the type of people that you know in your school. Well, during the dictatorship, most of public universities were closed. So basically, there was much less opportunities to have these type of interactions just because it was a dictatorship. And this is exactly the type of idea that we have in mind. But again, I mean, I what you say is true, and we're trying to exploit that. But again, we shouldn't take this as a completely sharp change in your life, but something that is more approximate, more fuzzy. Okay, but it's true. We're trying to exploit that. Okay, so again, this strategy was used in many papers in economics in the last 10, 15 years. Well, actually less than that, 5, 10 years. We are exploiting basically that. As you can imagine, the empirical strategy is basically this. So basically what we're estimating is this model. Here you have the outcomes that we can measure at the individual level for each country. We have this basically our treatment variable, that is an average of exposure to democracy in the years between years 18 and 25, that varies by individual in each country. So basically by each cohort, we're exploiting this cross-cohort variation. We are of course having country and year fixed effect, and actually for those outcomes for which you have many waves, we also have the year of the wave fixed effect. And naturally we control for other things, other events that happen to these people exactly during the impressionable years, because we try to isolate democracy from other things that could be going on. So basically we have, for example, we control for GDP during impressionable years, growth of GDP, standard deviation of GDP. We have an index of in-street conflicts during the impressionable years. So basically we control for everything that we have, and we try to isolate just the effect of exposure to democracy. Now, in a few robustness check, we also include another set of interactions to show that this is robust. And as you may imagine, what I'm going to show you is that the effect is significant during this time of the life and is not significant in other periods of life. So that's going to be basically the main idea. Okay?
Nicolas? Yes, I was thinking that, did you try to control for inequality, but because inequality should be correlated with democracy and also with civic behavior?
Mm-hmm.
Also, I would think that inequality has a lasting effect, in the sense that if I was in an unequal country when I was 18 to 25, probably that changed my perception of the world and how I will behave in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing is that we don't have good measures of inequality for all the years. We do have for some, and we do it with the subsample, and we find very robust effects. But yeah, it's a good point that we should maybe emphasize that more. But yeah, absolutely.
And also, rather than controlling, I would expect that the effect of democracy on civic behavior might be different for different level of inequality. Not only that is a control, but also that there is an heterogeneity effect. Yeah. Because you have democracy, but democracy can have different effects. In some countries, they lead to more equal countries, and in another to more unequal countries. And they might have different effect on civic behavior.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, we haven't explored that, but that's definitely an interesting point to explore. Yeah, thank you. All right, so let me show you. I think I have 15 minutes, so let me show you the main results. just to remind you, we have an index of behavior, cooperative impersonal behavior. We have index of civic values. We have an index of support for democracy. We have social preferences, and we have beliefs. So I'm going to show you some results on each of these outcomes. So let me go to the first result, which is basically our index of civic engagement, which again is an index of behavior. So how do we read this table? Again, we include different set of controls just to show that this is quite robust. And actually, we are going to run an Oster type of robustness check to show that actually there's a reason why we don't find why we find this very robust, which is that we are probably capturing with these controls unobservables. And let me very briefly tell you how we read this. So basically, this is all computed all normalized in standard deviation. So basically, both democracy and all of our outcomes are going to be expressed in standard deviation. Okay, and the way you have to think about the exploratory variable is as a continuous variable that basically captures the average of democracy in the 7 or 8 years of impressionable years. Okay, so basically this means that, for example, increasing the exposure to democracy during impressionable years by 1 standard deviation has this effect in terms of standard deviations in each outcome. Okay, so in this case, in civic engagement. Now, is this big or this is small? Well, that's relative. When you take a look, for example, to the paper of Giuliano, the first paper that is doing this, and where they find the effect of growing up in a recession on preferences for equality or distributional preferences, they find approximately very similar effects in terms of magnitude. So 0.02 standard deviation, 0.4 standard deviation, and so on. Now, I mean, this could be small, but if you think about the big, swings in terms of democracy that many of the countries, in particular in our region, suffered, in different cohorts, then this is actually quite big. So think about an individual that was born in Venezuela, for example, in the late 90s versus an individual that was born in Venezuela in the late 60s. So basically, the index of democracy that this person is going to be exposed to probably varies by 3 or 3.5 standard deviations. So there's a huge increase or decrease in exposure to democracy. So this means that this individual that was born in the 90s in Venezuela will have, 0.12 standard deviations more cooperative behavior than the same individual that was born, 20 years ago or 20 years before. So I think depending on the context, this could actually be quite a large result. Okay, so this is the outcome in terms of behavior. Okay, so this is basically, remember, this reflects the idea of impersonal cooperation, donating money, donating blood, helping others, and so on. Now, as we said before, this could be sustained, or the literature would say that this could be sustained by preferences or beliefs. So I'm going to show you first some results related to preferences and some results related to beliefs. So this is the first result, that is the civic values index. This index that try to reflect impersonal prosociality, which is basically this index of individualism. And again, we find even similar magnitude. So basically, growing up in a democracy will have an effect, 1 standard deviation more democracy will have an effect of 0.02, 0.03 standard deviation more in terms of how civic are the preferences or the values of these individuals. And let me skip this one because otherwise I won't have time. As I said before, the literature, the experimental literature basically shows that a cooperative behavior, when it's sustained by preferences, it could be sustained potentially by 2 types of social preferences. One is reciprocity, so it could be the case that you behave in a more impersonal cooperative way because you have certain norms of reciprocity. Okay, so basically you do the others what you expect the others to do to yourself. So this could sustain cooperation, or it could be that you just are altruistic. So basically, you are going to help others just, because you like the others to be happy. And in a way, the material payoff of others is going to enter directly into the utility function. So these two things could be happening. What we find is that actually norms of reciprocity really matter, and altruism doesn't matter at all. Okay, so in any case, we cannot find any significant effect in terms of altruism, but we do find an effect in terms of the norms of cooperation. Now here I put average reciprocity. This is basically the average between positive reciprocity and negative reciprocity, which both of them are actually significant, but it's just to save some time. Okay. All right, so that's about preferences. Let me give you some idea about the results on beliefs, again, on trust in beliefs. And again, what could be happening is that, this is not a matter of what you like, what all your values and your preferences, it's just, kind of a strategic behavior that is driving your cooperative behavior, and this could be sustained, but what the literature typically measures as interpersonal or generalized trust. So as I said before, we have measures of generalized trust, and then we have measures of in-group trust and an out-group trust, and what we find is what is expected to sustain impersonal cooperation. That is a strong effect on generalized trust, a strong effect on trust in strangers, which is basically people outside your kin, people that you don't know, and no effect on trust in people that you know or trust in your family. Okay, so basically this means that there is an effect on preferences, there is an effect on beliefs, but the effect on beliefs is, as expected, related to people that you don't know, and is not related to people that you already know. And if you think about this, this makes sense, because again, what we try to explain here is this idea of impersonal cooperation. And again, if you believe this story that the scope of cooperation, the scope of interactions that you have in your impressionable years is what actually matters, then it would be kind of strange to find an effect on cooperation or on trusting beliefs in people that you know, because actually the idea is that you're exposed to new people and you learn to deal with new people and to cooperate with people that you didn't know before. Okay? So this is going to be consistent with that. Then we run a couple of robustness checks, which I'm going to skip, an Austrian analysis and a multiple hypothesis testing analysis, but I'm going to skip that because I think I have like 5 minutes. So let me focus on what I think are basically the most important tables of the paper, which are the comparisons of exposure to democracy during the impressionable years and exposure to democracy during the other periods of life. Okay, so what do we do here? Basically what we do is we run horse races. Okay, so we run horse races between the index of democracy during the impressionable years and the index of democracy in different periods of lives. And basically we try to keep kind of the periods in 8 years, for basically for up to 40 years old. And then what we do is we create what other papers have done, which is an index of lifetime exposure to democracy, which is basically, you have to think of this as, kind of the sum of or actually an index based on the sum of the indexes of democracy that an individual is exposed, basically during your entire life, okay? What do we find here? Well, you should focus on the first column. What we find, obviously, again, so the level of robustness is, I think it's acceptable. It's not that we find exactly what we want, but we find something, I think, acceptable in terms of robustness. Basically, in every index that we present, what matters, what seems to matter, is the exposure to democracy during the impressionable years, and not the exposure to democracy during any other period of life. And again, this is the case with almost all of the outcomes that we present, with some exceptions like here, but most of it we have something quite robust. Even in those periods in which it could be the case that exposure to democracy also matters, even in those periods, exposure during 18 to 25 seems to matter even more. So basically, this seems to be quite robust in any of the variables that we use. Okay, so basically, what is the main idea of this part of the paper? Showing that what matters in exposure to democracy, as the impressionable year thesis suggests, is not democracy in your life, but actually democracy in the moment in which you have potentially more interactions with strangers, that is during your early adulthood period of life. Okay. Okay, I think I have, maybe 2 more minutes, so let me show just one additional result, which I think, or 2 additional results, which I think are important to understand the persistence of the effect, which is what we call the civic culture, or the effect of the civic culture over the life cycle. And I'm going to show you basically two results that I think are important. One about the timing of democracy imprint. So basically, for how long does this effect persist, and something related to what I call extensive versus intensive margin of democracy. Okay, so the first question is what happens after the impressionable years, or in other words, what happens once you get older and you continue with your life, and you were once exposed to democracy during the impressionable years, but then you were exposed to other type of regimes in the rest of your life. So what we do here is we basically interact the age of the individual with the treatment, which is exposure to democracy during the years of the impressionable years, and this is what we find. So if there was kind of a phasing out effect, meaning that when you grow older, then the effects start to go down, then we would expect this to be negative. And what we find is that it's typically zero. If any, it's becoming even more stronger as you become older. So basically, we find exactly the same in any outcome. What matters is the impressionable years, and getting older is not making any difference. Once you are exposed to democracy, then that effect is going to persist for life. So that's one thing that I find particularly interesting. Allow me to do just one additional result, which is related to what I called the margins of democracy, or the intensive versus extensive margin of democracy. Okay. So when I started describing the data, I told you that one thing that I value a lot about this data set, about this definition of democracy, is that it let me compare what happens with 0 versus 1 democracy, meaning you are democratic or not, versus the quality of democracy. And I'm reason to think that actually the quality of democracy matters, and that is not the same to be in the US in the 40s that in the 90s. Okay, so basically, you could think that in both cases there were a relatively strong electoral democracy, but clearly the quality of democracy was not the same. I mean, there was voter suppression, there were many things that were not the same as today. So that may have an effect. So what we do is basically we create an index, a binary index of democracy based on a paper by Ajzenman, and I don't have time to define it very well, but again, it's an index that is going to be 0 or 1 depending on basically if there's a electoral democracy or not, and we're going to compare that index with our continuous index of democracy in the same equation. Okay, so what we have here is our continuous measure of democracy, and what you have here is a binary measure of democracy using our data set, or polity, which is an alternative data set. And what we find consistently is that what matters the most is certainly the intensive margin of democracy, meaning the quality of democracy matters, besides just a 0-1 measure of democracy. And we find very similar results for almost every outcome that we use. I'm sorry that I'm going a bit fast, but I think I don't have more time. So let me conclude. I think I'm just in time. Let me conclude with the main idea that we try to transmit in the paper and the discussion of what we're trying to do next. So what we're trying to do next is basically try to understand a little bit more what are the different dimensions. This is something that I said before. What are the effects of different dimensions of democracy? So you asked at some point if it's the same to think about electoral democracy or racism and so on. Well, it turns out that it's not the same. So different dimensions of democracy have different effects on the cooperative culture. We're trying to explore that. We have some reasons to believe that different types of political regimes besides democracy could also have an effect. So one thing that we're thinking about, for example, is what happens with populism, what happens with polarization. So there are many reasons to think that actually democracy in a very polarized environment could be very different, right? You grow up during this time in the US and it's a democracy, but then you think that half of the country is crazy. You can be in one or the other side, and you think that the other side of the country is crazy, and that could certainly have a different effect in terms of trust to others. So I try to explore that dimension, but the main idea of the paper, kind of wrapping up, is that actually institutions can have a strong effect on culture. And this is important because there's a growing literature showing that democracy have an effect on growth. There's actually this paper by Ajzenman showing that that growing up, but actually that democracy triggers growth. And if that's the case, then this piece that they are trying to explore now, which is the effect of democracy on culture, could be actually the missing link between democracy and growth. that is widely documented in the literature. So in a way, we are trying to explore a potential channel by which democracy could affect growth as it has been shown to affect it. I mean, to affect it in the literature. So that's basically it. So yeah, I have a few additional results, but that's the main idea, and I think I'm just in time. So thank you very much, and all your comments and questions are obviously more than welcome. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nicolas, for this great presentation and very interesting paper. I know we have probably no more than 5 minutes, but I have a question regarding your vision of what is happening within this black box of the impressionable years. You are now estimating an effects of democracy on the development of civic culture and other kind of related variables. But do you think that other kind of institutions will interact with these impressionable years in the same way? I'm thinking on institutions related with, for example, markets or quality of education, between others. I mean, what do you think is happening within this particular part of the life cycle? How do you think other kind of institution will interact with that part of the life cycle on this idea of culture?
Yeah,
can I complement the question, Raimundo?
Yeah, sure.
Because I was thinking about that the identification strategy, maybe you deal with reverse causality, but I'm more worried about omitted variables, and because you have many institutions, as Raimundo said, and might be affecting both democracy and civic behavior. And for example, I was thinking a lot about religions. It's like probably if you were in your 18, 20 years, you were very intensive in a very religious country. Probably you have more social interactions that are going to affect your civic behavior, but also it's quite related to democracy. So how do you deal with that? With the intensity of religion and maybe with the type of religions, because you have different type of religion that some they are more democratic than others.
Yeah, so let me answer first your last point. I think they're both good points. So this is the way I think about it. So first of all, we try to control for many things that will try to help, ruling out potential other confounders. What you mentioned about religion, the way I see it is actually, we are exploring that. Actually, we're exploring the effect of religion, but the way we are seeing this is a bit different. So religion is quite constant, and we have a lot of cross-cohort variation. So it's very difficult to find, when you take a look to the, kind of a time series of religion, it's very difficult to find very strong swings in religion. You basically find that there are some countries that are more religious, some countries that are less religious. Obviously, you have some secular patterns. So the world is becoming more or less religious, but it's very difficult to find this very, it's not that you're going to have one generation that was much less religion and then that changed. So I'm not very worried about that. But what we're trying to explore now is actually we're trying to explore kind of the country-specific variables. The interaction between some country-specific variables like religion that could have on the effects that we find. So for example, and this links with Raimundo's point. So what I have in mind and what we're trying to explore some data to be able to kind of pin down this is that the reason why the impression of year matters is that because this is the best moment in life in which you can have certain type of interactions that you wouldn't be able to have in other times of your life. And democracy, this interaction happens, whereas autocracy wouldn't let those interactions happen. And again, I'm going to put again the example of education. Again, there's this anecdote, right? But I know a lot of people of the generation of my parents that they didn't go to university basically because it was closed. Okay? It was closed by the dictatorship. And again, this is something that you cannot recover. Once they didn't go to university between 18 and 25 years old, they didn't go. That's it. And I think the reason why this moment of life could actually matter interacting this moment of life with the existence of or not of democracy is precisely because in that moment of life, certain type of interaction can only happen when there's a democracy, and once that moment happens, then that's it. And this is what we're trying to explore. We're trying to explore what happens in countries in which there's, kind of a country-specific level higher of education. So let's say, in Argentina, since year 1918, public and free education was there, and therefore, if schools are open, then it's more likely to go to school or to university. So we're trying to explore this type of heterogeneity that are country-specific. Religion is a different one, to try to show that the interactions that you can have in that moment of life actually make much more sense and are much more likely to happen if there's a democracy. So that's the way I try to think about it, and that's the way that's exactly what I'm trying to explore. If you think, and sorry, let me link this with one additional thing, which is the dimensions of democracy. If you think about electoral democracy, that's a different thing, right? Because there are many, there are many moments of life in which you can actually, exercise democracy in the sense that you can go and vote. And that's, so imagine that during 18 to 25, you didn't vote because there was an autocracy. Well, that doesn't mean that you're not going to vote in the future, right? So in a sense, we think that exploring different dimensions of democracy would try to help us to pin down what is going on in terms of what type of interactions you can have in democracy and in autocracy. So I think that's kind of the idea that we're trying to explore now.
I have a question more on the exogeneity of the democracy variable. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking that, for example, in Chile, right, the big, or most of the political changes were driven by people between 18 and 25, mm-hmm. right? So, of course, if that's the case, then you see that there's an endogeneity issue. So maybe there are some other cases, I'm thinking like Eastern Europe, right? Sometimes the democracy changed in Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia at that time, right? For something that happened in Moscow, right? So that are the sort of great variations that, young people in Hungary and, all those countries didn't have any causality effect on the change in the, but for any other revolution that young people were involved, mm-hmm. probably there is an endogeneity issue. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that's actually something that we are concerned about. So that's actually reverse causality. So probably what you have in mind is that, you have the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring was basically triggered by young people that were very democratic in their values, and that triggered a change in democracy, and that's what you're capturing. So this could be a problem. What we're trying to do to rule out this is, but again, we don't have results yet, is to show that, so imagine kind of an event study in which you have, periods of democratization in different countries. So what we're trying to show is that previous to this period, the level of civic values were very similar between countries with and without democratization, at least the trends. So if that's the case, then that would be less of a problem, because you could treat these democratization events as more exogenous than that's triggered by culture. So, but yeah, that's I think, to be honest, that's the thing that bothers me the most in terms of exogeneity, and we're trying to live with that. But that's certainly a good point.
Great. Well,
Nicolas,
thanks everyone.
Sorry.
Okay.
I don't know anything about this topic, but it seems that religions have changed a lot over time. So I sent you a link that I just Googled, mm-hmm. and it seems that younger, for example, they are far less intensive in religion than, for example, our parents. So, and if you see the graph, they are quite similar, maybe to some. Mm-hmm. Yeah. To your graph of democracy. So I think that.
I'll take a look, but my point is that what you find is basically a similar effect. So basically, your parents are probably more religious than you, but basically the variability in democracy is much more, I wouldn't say random, but basically you have a lot of, for example, in Argentina, you have, 7 episodes of dictatorship, right? And then, religion was going down kind of secularly, but then in the middle you have all this. But yeah, no, I'll take a look. I'll take a look to the data.
Okay. in honor of time, I think we will stop here. Nicolas, thank you very much for this very great presentation, and hope that all you guys that came to this seminar also participate in the coming months. So please check your emails when news come. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon. Bye-bye.